All right, well, welcome everybody. Happy New Year, happy 2026. Thank you so much for joining us on what is the first day back for some folks for work. Hope everybody had a good holiday. Uh, my name is Jason Bailey. I'm the executive director at the Kentucky Center for Economic Policy, and I want to welcome you to this webinar where we're going to just provide a high-level overview of where things look as we head into the 2026 budget debate. As you may know or probably know, the General Assembly reconvenes for their 60-day session tomorrow. The most important job they will take on during that period will be developing the next 2-year state budget that will carry us on through 2028. And some of the most important decisions that are made in Frankfort, and the most consequential decisions that are made in Frankfort, regard the state budget. So it's very important for Kentuckians during the 60-day period to be attuned to what's happening and weigh in with their decision makers on where they think things should go. So we're just going to give some high-level information, some ways to potentially take action and stay involved and stay informed as we move into the session, and then let you go. So thank you all again for joining. The state budget is, sometimes we call it, the most powerful tool that that the General Assembly has, that we have collectively as a state to make people's lives better, to address problems, to fill gaps that the markets will not fill on their own. And there are many, many, many ways in which the state budget sort of courses through our lives and our community, sometimes in ways people don't even notice. You know, there's more than about 1.5 million Kentuckians, kids, seniors, people with disabilities, the elderly in nursing homes, that working poor that receive Medicaid. We've got 90% of kids who are enrolled in public schools. We've got about 500,000 Kentuckians receiving SNAP food assistance, many people in public higher education, either community college or public universities, et cetera. Lots and lots of different ways. So when this tool is working well, we can do things to lower poverty, to improve health, to address the quality of life. When it's not, we see those problems get worse. So the health of our budget is extremely important to the lives of every single Kentuckian. Since 2008, when the Great Recession hit, we have lost some significant ground when it comes to the budget. And we have a preview report that we released in December that provides a whole lot more detail than I'm going to go into today about where things stand coming into the budget. But one of the important issues is that post 2008, there were cuts made to a lot of areas in ways in which funding was frozen for a number of years. And we never have gone back and made up that lost ground. And it's been, 15 plus years now where we're dealing with those effects. So if you look at core funding for schools, what's known as SEEK, those are 25% below inflation-adjusted 2008 levels. The average teacher salary is about 20% below. Higher education funding is 29% below what it was back then. We have 13% fewer state employees. And for retirees who haven't received cost of living adjustments, their checks are worth 43% less than they were back then. So those are just a few examples. There are other areas where more money has been put in, but when you look at the broad set of services that many Kentuckians rely on, we've definitely lost ground. That's part of the context as we go into this next budget. We did, however, in recent history, have an unexpected opportunity, ironically so, in the pandemic. This is annual general fund revenue growth. That's the main source of revenue for our budget. That's the taxes that we pay, the income, sales, state property, and other taxes that we pay. You see that during the Great Recession years, 2008, 2010, after you adjust for inflation, revenues actually declined. Once we began to recover from that, you saw some growth, fairly modest growth in some years. But then really when the pandemic hit in fiscal year 2021, 2022, we really saw some strong growth. And so some opportunity to make up some lost ground. But for reasons I'll talk about momentarily, that was sort of a unique period. And in fact, we saw most states have this kind of very strong growth the last couple of years. Largely, what the General Assembly did with these funds was not reinvest in those core services. Instead, they did two things. One is stow the money away in what's called the Budget Reserve Trust Fund or Rainy Day Fund. You can see historically this is the balance, the amount of money we've had in that Rainy Day Fund going back to the early 90s. And the yellow line is sort of, a really good number. That's kind of what you want to have put away in your reserves to help prepare for rainy days and help deal with the shortfalls that result. You can see we didn't do a good job of putting money away. So we needed to do that when these extra monies came in. The General Assembly, though, went beyond that and put a huge amount of money into the Budget Reserve Trust Fund. Started to spend some of that money down in the last session, but still there is a significant balance in that fund. So that's one of the things they did, largely stow the money away. The other thing that they did was begin to enact permanent tax cuts, and particularly reductions in the individual income tax. Kentucky's had an individual income tax since the 1930s, and it had a top rate of 6%. It was reduced to 5% back in 2018. And then the General Assembly, during this period where monies were flush, a lot of revenue coming in, enacted a law that creates a so-called trigger mechanism that they say gives them permission to lower the individual income tax by a half a point a year, with this explicit goal in state law of getting that tax down to zero. So they have been following that law, but also changing the rules on that law to allow these income tax cuts to trigger. There have been 3 reductions as of January 1st. The rate goes down to 3.5% as of January 1st. And these cuts are very, very expensive. So before the individual income tax began to be reduced in this manner, 41% of what we collect to pay for our budget, to pay for schools, infrastructure, healthcare, and other things, came from the individual income tax. So you can sort of imagine that when you reduce it as much as we have and as much as the goal in state law to get it to zero, this is extraordinarily expensive. And there's really nothing that's being done to replace this lost revenue in the plan that the General Assembly is pursuing. There were some sales taxes applied to some services initially, but even that has sort of stopped, and the lawmakers are just cutting. Again, that hasn't been a huge challenge when revenues were strong and they were coming in as fast as they were for a couple years there, but that in fact proved to be a temporary situation, really fueled by the federal stimulus that Congress passed that provided aid to people, put money in people's pockets for things like unemployment benefits and stimulus checks during the pandemic. People spent that money, it circulated in the economy, created strong job growth and revenue growth, but that has faded now, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. In the meantime, the costs of making these permanent cuts to the individual income tax based on temporary economic conditions that weren't set to continue is starting to add up. And the cost, again, of reducing the income taxes from 5 to 3.5%, which lawmakers have now done, is about $2.1 billion annually. And to put that in context, that's more than the core funding for K-12 schools, for all of our K-12 schools at the state level, what they spend, what's called SEEK, that's about $2 billion. It approaches the Medicaid spending that we do. It's more than we spend on higher education, et cetera. So really one of the biggest outlays in funding in state history has been these half-point reductions to the individual income tax. It is a hugely monumental decision of how to allocate resources, and it's becoming very, very expensive, and the cost of that is beginning to come due as these cuts are being phased in. So there's several, I think, trends and threats that lawmakers face as they go into the 2026 session and develop a new 2-year budget. First is the implementation of these state tax cuts. They were designed to be phased in over time. The phasing in is happening, and the revenue is being hurt as a result. The economy is also slowing for other reasons, for reasons outside of the state's control and have to do with federal policies around tariffs, around immigration, around budget cuts at the federal level. Is causing the economy to slow, and that is affecting revenues as well. And then we have a new development in 2025 in that Congress passed H.R. 1, so-called One Big Beautiful Bill Act, That includes significant other cuts in federal programs and the shift of costs over to states like Kentucky's that they then have to deal with that they didn't have to deal with before. So to take these in a little more detail, again, with the national economy, it is certainly the case that job growth is slowing down. If you look at the national picture, since April, barely any jobs have been added. We're a few months behind because of the federal shutdown and so forth on terms of state numbers, but the state picture is pretty much mirrored this. We've seen a slowdown in job growth, and that affects how much revenues are available. And we have seen that the picture in 2021 and 2022, where we had really strong revenue growth as a result of the federal pandemic stimulus, that has really stopped and even reversed. And we are returning to the kind of period we had, back during even the Great Recession or other recessions, where revenues just are not keeping up with inflation. You can see that starting in 2023 and all the way through the forecast of 2028, you see revenues growing slower than inflation. There is a real decline in the amount of money that we have as a state to pay for the things I talked about at the beginning of this presentation. At the same time, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there are new costs being shifted to the state that it hasn't had to deal with before. One of the biggest of those is for the SNAP Food Assistance Program, which again provides food aid to over 500,000 kids, seniors, people with disabilities, low-wage workers. The H.R. 1 that passed Congress that the president signed shifts more of the administrative costs of SNAP over to states. In Kentucky, that's $66 million more by the year 2028. And for the first time in the history of the program, which goes back to the war on poverty, the state can be required to pick up a portion of the actual program cost, the actual cost of the benefits, which could be up to $188 million a year for Kentucky starting in 2028, depending on a calculation of what's called the error rate that states have. So we're talking about a potentially very large new outlay of resources that the General Assembly is going to have to fund at the same time that, again, revenues are slowing down. And just put that amount of money in context, $66 to $254 million a year. We only spend $84 million a year, the state does, on preschool. So these are very large numbers. These are equivalent to a huge new program that the state is going to have to pick up. We're also going to begin to see the impacts in this budget of federal Medicaid cuts that were in H.R. 1. Those are being phased in over time. They're very, very expensive, very costly to the program. And a lot of people are going to lose their health coverage as a result due to new rules that are being put in place that states like Kentucky are going to have to pay to implement. We also know from studies that have been done that we have more hospitals that are at risk of closure if these federal cuts are allowed to continue than any other state. We have 35 rural hospitals across the state that are at risk of closure. So the risk of the loss of services, the loss of coverage that affects not just Medicaid recipients, but anyone who has to use these services is very serious as these cuts and shifts go into effect. And the state is going to have to figure out how it's going to budget for and deal with these problems. At the same time, we know that for most Kentuckians, the concerns about things like healthcare, food, and other needs, and most Americans for that matter, is growing and is considerable. Affordability is the number one issue that everyone reports when they talk about what they're concerned about. They're concerned about the cost of electricity, the cost of housing, the cost of healthcare, the cost of their food when they go to the grocery store. There are many things that states can do to help deal with this problem, but this is what people are concerned about. And there are many ways in which the budget helps with affordability issues, but if there's not enough money in the budget, those things get hurt. We saw that last month when the senior meals program was cut to deal with a shortfall that already exists in this year's budget. We know that will be an ongoing challenge, that those funds will restored, but that's one of the many things that may be at risk as we go through the next budget. So in terms of the affordability issues and the income tax cuts that lawmakers have put into effect, We wanted to really understand better what those impacts were. We talked about how expensive the income tax cuts are. It will be $2.1 billion in 2026. That's, again, more than we spend on base funding for K-12 schools. So there was a poll recently done by Change Research that looked at surveyed registered voters in Kentucky, over 2,000 registered voters, and asked them, among the questions that were asked were, how have the individual income tax cuts impacted you? And Kentuckians reported back that only 9% of Kentuckians reported that the income tax cuts have helped them. Almost as many said that the cuts have actually hurt them in terms of reducing the income tax. 40% said they haven't been affected, and 43% are not sure. So it certainly was not a resounding result that this huge new outlay of resources that the General Assembly has put into effect by deciding to reduce our largest revenue source is something that Kentuckians say is really benefiting them. Why is that? Well, one of the reasons that may be is that when you reduce the income tax, most of the money goes to people at the top. So this is a chart from the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, their analysis of individual income tax reductions in Kentucky. You can see that around 60% of those cuts go to the top 20% of people who make more than $135,000 a year. In fact, the top 1%, the richest 1% of Kentuckians who make $610,200 and above in income, receive more from those income tax cuts than do the bottom 60% of Kentuckians, low and middle and working class Kentuckians combined. So the income tax cuts are really skewed to the people at the top. For the average Kentuckian, a half-point cut may be enough to pay for one phone bill or one oil change, not enough to really make a difference in the affordability challenges that folks face, but enough to take a lot of money out of the budget that would otherwise go to things that could help. To put it also in a different context, the cost of these half-point income tax cuts, if they were put into something like education, it can make a real difference. So just for the same cost as a half of a point income tax cut, which is $718 million a year, we estimated how much putting that amount of money into our schools, what that would allow each and every district to do. And we have a report on this on our website. You can look at to understand better, but it would essentially allow us to pay for an 8% raise for teachers and, say, employees, school employees help deal with the shortage in our public schools, hire over 2,000 more teachers and school counselors and other staff to lower class sizes, improve mental health, pay and have additional funds, about $59 million statewide, to pay for things like more bus drivers, more family resource centers, and free school meals, etc. And this is just a fact sheet. We have a fact sheet for every school district showing what it would mean in Pike County, but every district would benefit significantly. So something that the top priority of lawmakers has been these income tax cuts. Very few people are saying that they are being helped by these income tax cuts, but we know that putting that same amount of money into other things like public schools makes a huge difference. The poll from Change Research also asked a number of other questions on this topic, and Kentuckians really go beyond saying that the income tax cuts are not helping them and support instead a policy of actually asking those at the top to pay more. So one of the questions it asks is, state doesn't expect to bring in enough money to cover its costs for the next couple of years for reasons I've talked about. To close this gap, would you prefer lawmakers focus on making cuts to schools, healthcare, and other public services, or generating more revenue by raising taxes on the wealthy? And by a margin of 69 to 31%, the poll, Kentuckian voters said they would rather generate more revenue by raising taxes on the wealthy. Similarly, the poll asked, would you prefer that lawmakers in Kentucky focus on reducing taxes for everyone, even if most of the benefits go to the wealthy, or improving schools, improving healthcare, and bringing down the cost of living? And by a margin of 72 to 28, Kentucky voters said they would rather focus on the latter. The poll also asked very specifically, would you support a wealth tax on the richest 5% of Kentuckians to pay for some specific things that help with affordability. And between 60 and 75% of voters said yes for every policy that was polled. So a state child tax credit of $1,000 a year to help families afford the cost of raising kids. 75% to 20% Kentuckians said yes, they would support that, paid for by a tax on the richest 5%. Similarly, with more affordable healthcare options, more funding for affordable childcare and expanding public preschool, which is one of the governor's priorities. 68% to 26% Kentuckians said yes, and as well as putting more money toward the Affordable Housing Trust Fund to build more units of affordable housing and deal with our housing crisis. So very broad support for raising taxes on the rich. And that question or that issue comes at a time when those folks, the people at the top, have received enormous tax cuts, both from the state cuts that have been passed over the last decade, but also federal tax cuts that have been enacted, both from H.R. 1 that I talked about earlier that cuts Medicaid and SNAP. It also awards large tax cuts, especially to the people at the top, as well as the 2017 Trump tax cuts. So we had this analysis done again by the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. How much in 2016 are the richest 5% of Kentuckians receiving in federal and state tax cuts because of those cuts enacted over the last decade? And the total is stunning. It's over $3 billion a year that the richest 5%, whose average income is over $600,000 a year, they're receiving over about $3.4 billion in tax cuts. Well, that's more than the state spends on the Medicaid program. So when you talk about a situation where potentially hundreds of thousands of Kentuckians can lose Medicaid coverage, when we have 35 rural hospitals at risk of closure, it seems like a real challenge until you look at the fact that the people at the very top have received enormous tax cuts, that even a portion of which could help address that problem if lawmakers were willing to go down that road. So we asked Kentuckians, we said the richest 5% of Kentuckians are collectively receiving $3.4 billion a year from recent federal and state tax cuts. Do you support a settle-up tax on the wealthiest 5% to help improve schools, healthcare, and public services? And similar to the previous poll results I talked about, 67% support, 26% oppose, and 7% are not sure. So there is wide support for actually going in a completely different direction than the priority, which has been to reduce the individual income tax. And there are a lot of things that can be done at the state level if there are more resources available to make life more affordable for the many. We put out a report that I'll also plug that's on our website. There's some things you can do to help make life more affordable, address this top issue of the cost of living that don't cost money, like helping support the growth of unions and improving the minimum wage. But there are other things that do cost money, and we outline some of what those are in this report. But if you look at the opportunity of having those at the top settle up for the tax cuts they've received by chipping in more and paying their fair share, these things don't seem insurmountable. So I want to leave you with just a few things. Again, the session will start tomorrow. What is decided for the budget is very consequential for services that Kentuckians rely on and things they care about. And so we want to encourage folks to go ahead and start now with being engaged. And this is a QR code that will just bring you to the contact page and help you find who your legislators are if you don't know who those are. We will be sending this information out after the call in case you're not good at QR codes or quick enough to do them, to use this one to access that information. But it's important that lawmakers hear from you at the beginning of the session as they begin to craft this budget. So we'd like folks to consider a message that says, Kentucky families are stretched thin and more people than ever are struggling with the cost of living. But the state income tax cuts the legislature has passed are not helping because most of the benefits go to the wealthy. At the same time, these tax cuts cost over $2 billion a year. We need for investments that can truly help make life more affordable for the many and protect our schools, healthcare, and more. And I'm writing to urge you to prioritize all Kentuckians by putting a halt to budgeting for further income tax cuts, instead asking the top to pay their fair share of taxes so we can invest in a better Kentucky for all. On that last paragraph, I will say a couple things. One is that um, the trigger for additional income tax cuts did not go off this summer because of the deteriorating budget conditions. However, some lawmakers are saying they may pass another tax cut anyway. So it's important that that not happen, and that lawmakers hear that message, that further digging this hole deeper is not the direction we want to go in. Even if they don't do that, they could pass a budget that is very austere and that makes room for additional tax cuts over the next 2 years. So we want them to halt that as well. We don't want them to cut funding for things so that more of these income tax cuts that go to the wealthy are happening. Instead, put a different idea on the table. We know that asking the wealthy to pay their fair share of taxes is very unlikely to become law by April 15th, but now is the perfect time to start this conversation as the impact of these cuts begins to show, and as the cuts to things like Medicaid that are happening at the federal level will continue to squeeze that program over time. It becomes a huge problem for the state, and we have to start the conversation now about a different direction that we want to go in. So that's the first thing, is to contact your legislators. You can also stay in touch and stay informed about what's going on in the General Assembly and what's in the budgets that are being proposed and debated by going to KY Policy's website, kypolicy.org. We have an email list you can sign up for. We're also on all of the social media platforms. If you'd like to follow us and keep up with the analysis that we put out, we will be making sure Kentuckians understand what is being debated and what the implications are for them. And then thirdly, we have a conference coming up. Our annual conference is on Friday, January 30th at the Campbell House in Lexington. You can go to our website, kypolicy.org/registration, and register for that. We always have a great group of people come together, and it will be an opportunity to dig deeper into these issues, talk about what the landscape looks like around them by the end of the month, and further get involved in these really, really important decisions. And the last thing I'll share is that we'd like you to please save the date of February 25th. We're hoping to hold an event on that day in Frankfort where we send a message to lawmakers about the budget and about what Kentuckians' priorities are, what they're concerned about, what works and what doesn't. So please save that date. Consider joining us in Frankfurt. We'll have more information soon on exactly what that will look like.